Hello, everyone. My name is Yohn, and I am so happy to be here with you today. I have an undergraduate degree in agricultural education and a master's in elementary education. And some of you may be wondering, how did I make the switch or even why? Let me tell you, agriculture texts are actually extremely complicated and have a very high lexile. So the transition was not as difficult as one would think. Agriculture is also steeped in important literacy skills, sequencing, tons of informational text, and comprehension. There's some really difficult texts out there that are agriculturally based that require a lot of comprehension. So I ended up becoming a reading teacher when there was a teacher shortage in my area. There were no agriculture positions open, but there was a middle school reading position open. And out of all the candidates that applied, they picked me for some unknown reason. But it was the start of a journey I will never regret. It has led me to where I am today. It has helped me discover my passion for reading education and a quest to understand the science behind reading, which brings us to our topic today, the science of reading. So, did you know that there is a science to reading? So, in the 70s and 80s, probably even before that, even into the 90s, there was what we like to call the reading wars. And there was a great discrepancy between how students were being taught to read. There was also a misunderstanding as to scientifically what is the best method or what are the components that go into reading education. So the US government commissioned the National Reading Panel, which was a group of highly qualified individuals who looked at scientific, research based reading information. And from that, the panels concluded a couple of things. Now, it's not completely black and white. And reading education is contingent upon a lot of factors, but experts do believe with the information the National Reading Panel found and concluded that 95% of students in our country can learn to read on grade level with the right literacy instruction, which includes those that have been diagnosed with dyslexia or maybe even have a learning disability. So, literacy in this country is possible. The important thing is it has to be presented to our students by highly qualified teachers, and they do need to follow some guidelines. So, the science behind reading required us as a country, as educators, as scientists, and experts, how do skilled readers read words and how do kids learn to read. And we've come to the conclusion that humans were not born to read. We were born to learn to walk and talk, communicate that way, but the written language was never really something we were born to do. It's something that we are evolving to do. I mean, if we really think about it, written language was created over a long period of time, and it had to become a consistent form of written language that people could understand and could be passed down. And now, of course, we have multiple languages across the world. But we were not born to read. Only about 5% of children will learn to read with little to no help. About 30% require some assistance, and the rest will need explicit and structured literacy curriculum so they can achieve the ultimate and somewhat elusive goal of true reading and comprehension. But there's so much involved in reading because it's a multifaceted skill that has to be acquired gradually over time with years of practice, right? And it starts with the fundamentals of what does reading or what does our language sound like? What are the sounds that our language uses? And it progresses into comprehending the written text and then being able to spit that back out, right? And communicate it with others. But you can see from the graphic here, there's so much involved in skilled reading. It takes language comprehension, which ultimately requires exposure to our language, and word recognition, which means you need to be able to accurately, efficiently, and rapidly recognize the words that you're seeing. So you can tell this is something that takes time and it builds upon itself. So let's answer the question, what did the National Reading Panel find? And what are the basics of the science of reading? And it discovered there are 5 essential elements to reading education, and they are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension strategies. These 5 elements are essential to an effective reading instruction. And even more essential is that students receive explicit, meaning intentional, planned instruction in a guided curriculum that builds upon itself throughout the year, but then across grade bands. It needs to begin in pre-kinder or kindergarten, and sometimes even past 3rd grade. I have seen in many schools that phonemic awareness and even phonics, sometimes vocabulary, is not covered enough past 3rd grade because it is expected that students have those foundational skills. But for a student who struggles to read fluently, we need to back up and cover phonemic awareness and phonics over again, especially for students who speak a different language at home and are bilingual, English second language, English language learners. These students are going to need extra emphasis in phonemic awareness and phonics, and help with fluency because of the multiple languages in their life. And studies show if they're going to be fluent in English, it's most helpful if they're also fluent in their home language. So we need to encourage that. And we're going to cover each of these essential elements in the next slides more particularly. So let's look at phonemic awareness, okay? So phonemic awareness is the sounds that we hear, mastering the individual phonemes in our language. There's quite a few examples that one can use to teach your students phonemic awareness. A lot of it deals with segmenting the sounds that students hear in our spoken language, isolating out what they hear, blending them together, substituting different sounds to create real or even made up words. When I was first learning all of this terminology around reading, it was told to me multiple times that phonemic awareness is phonics with the lights off. It is not focusing on the written text, it's focusing on what we hear. This is why students who have a hearing disability at a young age and maybe need their tubes tied and then struggle with speech, phonemic awareness, and then building onto phonics and fluency can be difficult for them. Not impossible, but requires some extra scaffolding to help them be successful. You'll see here on this slide a couple examples that you can use in your classroom. These are 3 of many, but the point of phonemic awareness is to get kids speaking and hearing and manipulating the sounds that they hear in our language to create words that we use to communicate. It's the building block to the alphabetic principle. So students need to understand the sounds in our language before they can ever understand the written language, right? So that leads us to phonics, which focuses more on the written language and the alphabetic symbol that we use in our English language to represent the sounds of our language, which is why we need to focus on the sounds before we focus on the sight. Students, or most kids, learn to talk on their own just by hearing people around them talk, right? Those that don't have some sort of exceptionality learn that skill easily. But then applying that to our written word and helping kids understand that these symbols in our alphabet represent the sounds, that takes a different thought process. And remember, we were not born to read. So this is a learned skill that must be taught over time, and students need to have practice. It must be systematic and explicit. Okay, so phonics is really talking about a set of rules that specifies the relationship between letters and sounds. So this must be systematic and explicit, and that means that it needs to be planned and it needs to build upon itself and have a natural progression with the goal at the end of kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade of students being able to quickly, we'll get to fluency, but being able to identify the sounds that letters make, decode known words and unknown words, and then practice spelling them based off of what they hear. All of these things are going to lead to students who have a better understanding of the alphabetic principle and then can move on to fluency. Once kids have really grasped phonemic awareness and phonics instruction, then we're really looking at them fluently reading. It's important that when we are assessing fluency and teaching fluency, we provide students with text that is not overly difficult. Not that we don't want to challenge our students, but we don't want to push them too far before they've gained the confidence to read grade level texts. So we've got to make sure that we're assessing their capabilities and providing them with texts that are just difficult enough that will allow them to gain confidence and be successful. So this is rapid word recognition and the reason it's important, some people have issues with fluency. The reason it is important because rapid recognition of a word and phrases frees up more space in the brain for a student to comprehend. If they spend a lot of time decoding words, right, that's phonics, and they never get to fluently reading with inflection and understanding, they're never going to be able to comprehend. So fluency really relies on modeling. As a teacher, it is important that we model fluent reading through read alouds. I think sometimes adults, teachers, parents, all of them alike, forget the importance of just reading out loud to our students or to our own children. And it is one of the most impactful things we can do for communication, social emotional skills, and fluency. It's really important that students have a good model example of how to fluently read. So we need to read out loud. We also need to pair students up, strategically pair students for partner reading. It's great practice. Students can learn from each other. And by modeling reading, by an adult modeling reading, and then having partner reading, and if you allow and require your students to reread the same texts and have multiple opportunities to interact with that text, they're going to, through practice, it's beautiful actually. They're going to come to a point to where they can read it fluently because of what they heard. And each time they become an expert on that one text, it is so neat what ends up happening. They can then take those skills and apply it to other texts that they read. So practice really is important when it comes to fluency. Good fluency requires 3 skills, which those 3 skills require their own neural transmissions. How many, I don't know, but accurate decoding, automatic word recognition, and the use of rhythms of spoken language, which is what we do in our everyday speech. Okay, vocabulary. This is where things get a little tricky. Vocabulary, students can enter school with varying degrees of vocabulary capabilities, and it's contingent upon the exposure of language and text that they have received before they entered school. So some teachers are faced with large gaps in vocabulary knowledge, and that is why we need to hit vocabulary hard from the beginning. We need to assess our students as they enter our classroom. We need to communicate with teachers and parents to know what students' baseline is. And then we need to incorporate some strategies so we can really increase that vocabulary. Examples are pre-teaching vocabulary that you're going to cover in the specific text. It doesn't have to be a long drawn out process. You can use graphic organizers to do this. Active engagement with vocabulary words that they are using. That's where the written word comes in. You need to require your students to write and use these words, to speak with them as you're communicating throughout the day. And then there are other word learning strategies that students need to be taught to use. And that's going to mean like dictionaries, reference guides, context clues, analysis of word parts, which of course gets into like 3rd and 4th grade, prefixes and suffixes and affixes. And I, as the complete nerd that I am, find that extremely Fun to dive into why words are made the way they are and what different suffixes and affixes mean. Word walls are also a really great way of doing this, and all of them help students to have more exposure to vocabulary. There are 4 types of vocabulary: listening being our loudest, speaking, reading, and writing. And our ultimate goal is for students to be able to use their vocabulary accurately as they write. We know that being able to write intellectually using the English language correctly is going to lead to better opportunities down the road for our students, and that is ultimately what we want. But it's important to note before we leave this slide, vocabulary intervention or prevention must be intense. We cannot just kind of haphazardly approach vocabulary. It must be intentional, and we need to flood their brains with vocabulary words in order for them to close those gaps. Comprehension strategies are another example of something that should be modeled by teachers. We need to show students how we comprehend the text. That involves a lot of thinking out loud, writing down notes, generating questions using graphic organizers, breaking down the structure of a text, thinking about why the author wrote something the way they did and what that means, using the knowledge we have from vocabulary. All of these things are important to comprehension strategies. You would think that if a student has phonemic awareness, is an expert at phonics, is a fluent reader, and has a large vocabulary, they would be able to comprehend. But again, we were not born to read. So these things need to be modeled, and students need to have practice. And after we model stuff, I think it's also important to allow students to talk. Ask them and probe them what their thoughts are about the text instead of always telling them ours. This is a very useful skill. So the next question is, how do we take all of this information from the National Reading Panel, understanding the 5 essential elements for reading education in this country, and apply that in our classroom? What does it look like in a day? Oh my goodness, how do we organize that? Well, the 5-block reading and writing model is a really great framework for scheduling a day in the classroom. It focuses on daily reading instruction so that all children receive daily instruction in the 5 essential components of early reading education. This was created by individuals in the Chicago Public Schools. They came up with this 5-block reading and writing model that has proven to be successful in bridging gaps. It is a 180-minute allocation of time that is ideally not interrupted by anything else. But, recess is also a really good time. It could be strategically placed within our reading and writing block. The important thing is that this literacy instruction is explicit and structured. Kids need to know what's expected of them and when it's expected. This really does lead to a classroom environment that fosters higher literacy. Kids thrive on structure. We know this. It allows their brains to focus on what they're learning instead of wondering what's next or being confused about what they're supposed to do next. It creates a pattern in their brain, which instills really good learning habits. So let's look here. We have word work. This is where you're going to practice recognizing the alphabet, hearing sounds, spelling high frequency words, and provide vocab instruction. Then you're going to move on to writing. This is where you would use those vocabulary words. You would really teach the rules and the fundamentals of writing in our language here in America, that mainly being English. Fluency, this is where you're going to do explicit modeling of fluency, and you're going to model it, and then you're going to strategically pair students to allow them practice of rereading texts multiple times. The goal with this part is rereading so students can become fluent. Comprehension, this is where the teacher is, of course, going to model comprehension. It's going to be more of a whole group setting. And then you're probably going to allow students to have small group discussions. I think that's really important to allow students to have self-autonomy, to be able to discuss text, but you're going to want to model it first. It'll look different as the year goes on. And my favorite part is small group instruction. This is where you're going to take everything you're seeing and assessing as a teacher and the other 4 blocks, and then you're going to be able to do some intervention time or some active engagement, and where you're encouraging students to think beyond what you're doing in the classroom, make connections beyond the classroom. But with small group instruction, I think it should be noted that you don't want students who are doing fine to just sit and not do anything. That's going to actively engage their brain and help them continue to grow. We don't want to stunt children that aren't struggling. We want to continue to push them and help them grow. So as we close our discussion on the science of reading, I feel it's really important to point something out. The students in this country can only reach true literacy through the help of educated professionals, us educators. And though it's an exhausting job, it is our responsibility to find the joy in it, show students that we're happy in our profession, and to educate ourselves on the science-based research that is out there in regards to reading education. We cannot settle. We cannot be teachers that just go through the motions. Students deserve to have the opportunity to become literate and successful adults. And this doesn't happen by chance. It's accomplished through intentional, explicit, structured literacy that uses texts that are relevant to their lives and cultures, but also helps to show them this beautiful and diverse world that we live in. Books are an opportunity for students to meet people and see places that they otherwise would not. It's an opportunity to travel the world while staying home. And if we don't teach them to be good, skilled readers, then we're taking that opportunity from them. We, as educators, must dive into the science of reading and instill a passion for reading in our students because it is truly the key to an equal world. Thank you very much for your time.